today we have with us Volodymyr Yermolenko, who is a professor of political thought, our colleague from also, and
from Internews. We're always happy to have him share his expertise.
And also Gulliver Cragg, who is a France 24 correspondent here in Ukraine, but not just, but also in Eastern Europe. And
so we have this special, panel we wanted to discuss is looking at Charlie Hebdo, but the Eastern European perspective, because obviously this is something. There are the events in Paris, and they continue to reverberate, and then there's this global sense, and I think in Ukraine you can already see, they've adapted Je suis to their own purposes and their own politics and things they're trying to emphasize, and the wider connection too being issues of freedom of speech there.
So do you think what was interesting for me, and there was pretty much some discussion that there was this terrorist attack in Ukraine, which is somehow very, very, very different from what had happened in Paris. And at the same time, and there is this campaign, at the same time we saw that a lot of leaders, a lot of political leaders from Eastern Europe went to not just from Eastern Europe, but all over the world, went to Paris for the march. And among them, there were people who were not really, let's say, not the guys who support freedom of press. What is your take? Is it just like a hypocrisy in that way that, we declare the values, especially in this region, we declare the values, but there is something different happening on the ground?
Well, maybe it's very specific. I mean, Gulliver, how have the protests here and the rallies here differed from those in Paris? Are there similarities, or are they clearly very different?
The rally today, well, the first difference is that there were just a few thousand people in Kiev, whereas, and I know in a few other cities around Ukraine, but in France, the rally was one of the biggest I think the country has ever seen, with millions of people taking to the streets, and here it was
so a huge difference in
much
scale.
Smaller. I mean, that's the first thing, but I have to say, a lot of French people very much resent the way that not only the Ukrainian government, but particularly the Ukrainian government have started using this hashtag and saying,
why is that?
Suis Volnovakha? Because it's not comparable. I mean, it's a tragedy what happened, that innocent people died, but this happened in the context of a war. The attack on the bus was clearly an attack on a Ukrainian checkpoint where the bus happened to be. It wasn't a deliberate attempt to target civilians in order to instill terror in the general population. So you can really dispute whether the word terrorism is applicable to that. I mean, but terrorism is a word that you can almost always dispute whether it's applicable. But clearly the things aren't the same, and there's a perception in France that Petro Poroshenko and the Ukrainian government thought that they could somehow use this in order to attract attention to the situation in Ukraine, and they did it in a very sort of intellectually dishonest way.
But I would disagree with that. I would disagree with that because this hashtag was not the Petro Poroshenko idea. This was a very spontaneous idea.
He put it as his avatar on Facebook.
But it was a very spontaneous idea from the society, and there is. I supported this hashtag. Why? First, because this is a sign of solidarity. Ukrainians were showing solidarity with the French people. They were showing, look, we are sharing your sentiment. We're using the same.
Solidarity is this Je suis Charlie.
Yeah, just let me finish. We share your sentiment. We are expressing it in almost the same words. And the second thing, of course, we are thinking. People were thinking in drawing attention to Ukrainian problems where people are dying every day. So I don't think this is a hypocrisy, and I don't think that you cannot compare these acts, because of course you can say that there is a war and people just died not because of specific terrorist act, but on the other hand you can say that the war which is going on by Russia is a kind of a geopolitical terrorism, because the aim of terrorism is to frighten, is to bring terror. The aim of the Russian campaign in eastern Ukraine is precisely to frighten, to throw these quasi-states as bombs. They're using this DNR, LNR as suicide states.
And I would like
to, for example, completely really destabilize the Ukrainian economy, and we've just been hearing on this show about the cost of the war and the problems.
The point is,
there are other aims, and the main thing that I would say is a very important difference, which Ukraine would be the first country to want to underline, is that there is clearly one state actor involved in the violence in eastern Ukraine, I mean that's foreign to Ukraine, which is Russia.
Yes.
It's not, the attacks on Paris were not an attack by Syria or by any other Arab country, they were an attack by French citizens. It's a very, very, very different situation.
But there is something I would also add on that the way you pointed, there is a campaign, there is a movement, some people support, some people not, nobody demands to do anything, and like, it's not like a must, it's not at all a governmental issue, so you can't forbid some people to read the signs in the other way. But I think that there was this article also in Guardian, a pretty interesting one, when we think not about like comparison of the event, but I would quote that that there is no connection, of course, between the Paris tragedy and the conflict in Ukraine, which is a domestic terrorist attack and external military aggression. But the common element is that the very essence of Europe, that the values are under attack. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly, and just let us look at the situation in a broader perspective. Of course, they are different. Volnovakha and Charlie are different, but it's like, you know, saying that pepper and salt are different, but they're in the same, you know, plate. Of course, they're different, but they're the elements of the same picture. Look at how Russian society, some of the Russian, you know, traditionalist people, like this journalist of Komsomolska Pravda, were reacting to Charlie. They were saying like, "Oh God, that's great that I'm living not in France, because in France you have all those papers who are, you know, mocking at religion, and they in Russia are not mocking at religion. And so France, they're taking the side of terrorists, basically."
But in France, the Je suis Charlie hashtag was not just to express sympathy with the innocent victims, but also people wanting to say that basically they support these cartoonists' right to publish these cartoons and to defend certain values in the way that they had chosen to defend certain values, freedom of speech. That's not true about Volnovakha. The people on the bus in Volnovakha, for all we know, were probably supporters of the DNR, of the separatists. They were on their way back to Donetsk, where they lived. They weren't, you can't...
I fully agree, but
it's cheap to compare these things.
No, it's not cheap. I fully agree with you're an empirical journalist, you know, you're saying from the journalist perspective. I fully agree with that. I mean, but if you look at a little bit broader, what is at stake? At stake is Western values, universal values. These are things which are at stake, and there are now two actors who are saying we are not accepting these values. We are fighting against them. This is fundamentalist Islam and Putin's Kremlin, Putin's Russia. They are doing it in a different, very different way, because fundamentalist Islam is saying, look, we use terror, but they think they are making a war. And Kremlin says, well, they are making a war, saying, well, this is not a war, etc., etc. But this is kind of a geopolitical terrorism, because they're doing the same, actually.
Well, just to widen the conversation a bit, we have a couple of tweets from our viewers because we asked them what they thought about it, and Nataliya had put one of them.
So the question was the biggest hypocrisy behind Charlie Hebdo march. What are the lessons for the East Central Europe? The first is from Nikolai Holmov, the Odessa blogger. Hypocrisy, if you view it as a free speech issue, at core it's a deeper violent challenge to rule of law, global order, and the state. That's what some people think. The other is like the dictator, authoritarian regime, all rely on rule of law, by law and sanctity of state, ISIS style of terrorism. But
I think in a way, if you view it as the way as an attack on Ukraine by a foreign power, which is Russia, which is the way the Ukrainian government views it, and with good reason in a way, then it's less comparable than if you take a different, maybe more leftist sort of view and say that the fact that so many people in eastern Ukraine have been prepared to support these separatist movements just shows how Ukrainian government policies have failed, and it's a result of poverty in those regions. And there you can make more of a comparison with France when you take it away from freedom of speech, or you take it away from foreign intervention and say, in France, France, it's because of poverty in the suburbs of Paris, and in eastern Ukraine, it's because of poverty and neglect by successive governments.
I would agree.
My question is why it's so sometimes hard, because is it the issue just misunderstanding when the people just follow something which, you know, might be a different sign, but I see that there is a pretty, like, some misunderstanding what is meant here, and I also think there was a lot of discussion by the politologists that in Eastern Europe, for instance, people didn't understood. I mean, like, at least media didn't understood this idea of the multiculturalism, and there were too many articles that, you know, multiculturalism failed in France, and that is a sign of that. So, do you think in larger area in Eastern Europe that we still in this kind of living in the time when some messages are seen differently by people in Kiev, by people in Hungary, in Poland, and by people in Western
Well, of course they're seen differently. I mean, it's very difficult for Ukrainian to understand Charlie Hebdo humor. It's very
difficult
even
for an English person.
For an English person, and like the British, was very interesting that the British media and English-speaking media like Vox and others were explaining this humor, and it's a very also dramatic thing because this humor was global. I mean, attacking Islamists or fundamentalists or even Muhammad, but basically its technique was very particularly French, yeah? But I think, well, and of course there will be miscomprehensions, misunderstandings, everything. But I think the good thing, the humanistic thing about this hashtag, which was first the social, very emotional reaction, and then it was used by politicians, whatever, is just to saying that we guys are all people and we have shared tragedies. You guys have your tragedy in France, we have our tragedy in Ukraine. So let's think collectively about it.
But it seems you know, what I struggle with a little bit, and I will admit I'm a little bit more on your side with this because I see the differences, but not.
I also see the difference, but I think.
Well, no, I'm just saying, you know, if you had looked at, for example, Nataliya, who we spoke with and who are here, this artist group that was in Donetsk that were forced out, these artists and graffiti artists who were arrested, and that's really a clear freedom of expression issue that I could see more one-to-one. But I actually wanted to ask Gulliver a different question, which is challenging this idea of values, because part of what was brought up before is, you know, France defending freedom of the press, freedom of expression, all of that. Ukraine, more state security interests in that, which is less exciting in a way. But, you know, you had these marches in Paris as well, where you had representatives from different governments who came. You had representatives of Russia, of Hungary, of Bulgaria, countries which do not support the freedom of the press. I mean, it seems like there's been an awful lot done when it comes to these protests that is a bit disingenuous.
Well, yeah, the French, I don't think they could really do that much to stop people from coming. I know that François Hollande didn't really want Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, to come because of the possibility that French Muslims might see that as a reason not to come on the march, or for various other reasons. But then Netanyahu insisted on coming, and therefore François Hollande said, okay, well, if you're going to come, then Mahmoud Abbas absolutely has to be there as well. But he didn't make the rules about who could attend. And certainly some leaders, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, is the one who most immediately springs to mind, clearly saw this as an opportunity to speak out against immigration and to say the problem is not freedom of speech, the problem is immigration. He said that in an interview to Hungarian TV while he was even in Paris. Yeah, Hungary ranks very low on world rankings for freedom of expression, and is repeatedly being ticked off by the European Union about the media law, which it passed in 2010 and which still hasn't really been revised to bring it into line with European rules.
And then turn Hungary into Russia often in terms of media control.
Well, yeah, I've just been reading today about how Hungarian media, which the ones which most feverishly support Viktor Orban and his Fidesz policy, do very much something similar to pro-Putin Russian media, in that they try to paint any criticism of Hungary's government as a foreign conspiracy.
Well, it just seems interesting to me because once something becomes so big, people try and connect to it. I mean, for politicians, they want to be a part of it for their own purposes. And I mean, I think that must be interesting for you, Volodymyr, to see, you know, when something gets to a certain level, it evolves to something else.
I think it will evolve in a very different ways, because the way how you can use the story of Charlie Hebdo is can be totally different, totally contradictory. You can, like Viktor Orban says, well, let's put an end to immigrants, to Islamists, and it will be right-wing message. And then the same right-wing people can say, no, look, they're attacking our religion, they're attacking Islam, they will attack Catholics, they will attack Orthodox, etc., etc. So this will be completely contradictory messages, and we will see how it will evolve.
Another interesting thing is that although we had some of the biggest demonstrations in French history on this Republican March, a survey subsequently showed that 42% of French people, that's nearly half, don't think that Charlie Hebdo should have published those cartoons. So even within France, there's not really as much unity.
But still, there is a difference. I mean, the one thing is that whether you think that you have not published, and the other thing is attack.
Of course, yes. I'm sure that there are people on the march who don't think there are people who are on the march who don't think they should have published the cartoons.
It's very good and very interesting that many people who criticize Charlie, and Charlie, well, it is criticizable. Let's be honest. I mean, you can criticize them, but it doesn't mean that you're backing these attacks and so forth.
Yes, of course. Yeah, there have been lots of people in France who've been saying that.
So that was a bit of a discussion we had. So thanks a lot for you. And I also would remind this week Volodymyr has prepared for us the media monitor, where he looked through the biggest article, the most important articles, and I mean, so that we can post and you can see it online, and not just the articles, but...
This was a very interesting analysis, new analysis of the Boeing crash, so I advise you to read that.
And since we are online, television, and we're working online, there are very many ways to do that, not just listen to people talking, but please follow our Twitter, and there you can see the link for the media monitor to get and to read it yourself, everything which is connected to Ukraine, as we also encourage you to watch and to go to our brand new webpage, int.hromadske.tv, where we have all our videos
and
articles together.